There is a 4-book series called The Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe that I have here in 2 volumes. I have 2 books per volume. I've just finished reading the first book of the series that was called The Shadow of the Torturer. I'm going to talk about that book and why I'm not going to be reading the other 3 books in this series. The reason that I chose to start reading this series, and in fact went out and purchased the whole thing brand new even, was because I heard it described as the fantasy Dickens. I heard that it was a fantasy series that had such amazing writing and prose that it was compared to Charles Dickens, which immediately caught my attention because it can be sometimes difficult to find well-written fantasy books. And from the Dickens that I've read, I have to tell you that no other author that I've ever read has impressed me so much with their command of the English language as Dickens has. So I figured, fine, this will be a blind purchase. I'm going to go out, get the 4 books, and dive into this series. So I was putting off reading this book until I figured I was ready for a potentially fairly dense read. And that came about because I was getting back into the whole Lord of the Rings series. I had started to read The Fellowship of the Ring to my older son, and I also discovered some YouTube channels that dive deep into the Lord of the Rings lore, and I was discovering all kinds of new stuff that I hadn't learned before, such as the fact that Gandalf is this ancient, millennia-old, angelic-like figure, and no wonder the Balrog didn't kill him, because he's this kind of semi-immortal, angelic type of being. So I was learning all these wild facts about Lord of the Rings and enjoying watching some of that stuff and diving more into the lore. So at that point I was like, okay, I'm ready to get into another world now, to dive into something that's going to take me deep into a world. And that's why I decided to give this series a shot. Now, the first thing I discovered is that it's not a fantasy series. It's actually classified as science fiction because the events of the books take place in the far, far distant future, even though it is very much a kind of sword and steel medieval-like setting. Somehow we have gotten to this point in the vast distant millennia where we've lost all of our technology and humanity has kind of cycled back to this medieval state. So the only things that remain from the technologically advanced predecessors of the distant past are maybe these giant hulking metal buildings or these incredibly huge structures that were built with the technologies of old. It doesn't get into why these technologies have been lost, although it does mention that humanity had become a starfaring race, that they had gone on to distant planets, that they had even brought back species from other planets to Earth. And some of the animal species that are mentioned in the book are strange creatures that have come from other planets, although unfortunately they don't really dive much into the description of them, so we can't really get a very good feel for what these animals are like. All we know is that this space technology and all that stuff is millennia in the past, and for whatever reason we're in this very medieval fantasy type of setting. But it's a very interesting premise in that the book is about an apprentice torturer who becomes disgraced and has to kind of deal with the fallout of some events that have turned his life upside down. So while I sort of recoil at the concept of torture and whatnot, it's an interesting starting point that it is a very young man who is learning the trade of torturing. Now, the prose in these books is just very well written. The author has a command of the English language, and there were frequently words that I just didn't recognize that were being used. So the writing itself is definitely on another level compared to most fantasy writing that I've read. Now, I'll give one example here of a particular character who's speaking. Admittedly, this character has a very flowery speech, so the manner of his talking isn't necessarily indicative of how everybody in the book talks, but it does give kind of one example of the writing. This character is talking to the young torturer, and he is saying, "Work your will upon those guilty. Where was their mercy on the innocent? When did they tremble? When weep? What kind of men could do as they have done? Thieves, false friends, betrayers, bad shipmates, no shipmates, murderers and kidnappers. Without you, where are their nightmares? Where are their restitutions so long promised? Where are their chains, fetters, manacles, and kings? Where are their abassinations that shall leave them blind? Where are the defenestrations that shall break their bones? Where is the estrapade that shall grind their joints? Where is she, the beloved whom I lost?" So, obviously not your standard style of writing, and I can already point out 3 words that I am unsure of their meaning. I don't know what cangs are, C-A-N-G-U-E-S. I'm not sure what abassinations are, A-B-A-C-I-N-A-T-I-O-N-S. Nor am I sure what an estrapade, E-S-T-R-A-P-A-D-E is. So, there's an example of one character. And it is at least somewhat indicative of how the book is written. Now, thankfully, the book doesn't go really into the torturing aspect of things. We do get one very brief, somewhat graphic description of a particular torture that was being done to somebody, but mostly it's just kind of in the background of this character's setting. However, the character also does some side work as an executioner. I guess that's part of the job description. And we have an interesting description from somebody talking about how to do a good execution. In fact, I think it's the main character who is talking here. He says, "The spectators will be content if there are no long delays, if the condemned is permitted to speak briefly and does it well, if the upraised blade gleams in the sun for a moment before it descends, thus giving them time to catch breath and nudge one another, and if the head falls with a satisfactory gout of blood. Similarly, you, who will some day delve in Master Altan's library, will require of me no long delays. Personages who are permitted to speak only briefly yet do it well, certain dramatic pauses which shall signal to you that something of import is about to occur, excitement, and a sating quantity of blood." I think a sating quantity of blood is what we look for from our modern day news networks. Now, despite that slightly grotesque background theme, the book does get into some interesting themes. For instance, we have this little passage that talks about free will and choices versus instinct. It says, "No intellect is needed to see those figures who wait beyond the void of death. Every child is aware of them, blazing with glories dark or bright, wrapped in authority older than the universe. They are the stuff of our earliest dreams, as of our dying visions. Rightly we feel our lives guided by them, and rightly too we feel how little we matter to them, the builders of the unimaginable, the fighters of wars beyond the totality of existence. The difficulty lies in learning that we ourselves encompass forces equally great. We say, 'I will,' and 'I will not,' and imagine ourselves, though we obey the orders of some prosaic person every day, our own masters, when the truth is that our masters are sleeping. One wakes within us, and we are ridden like beasts, though the rider is but some hitherto unguessed part of ourselves." On the next page following that, there's a slightly humorous look at religion. At one point, the main character is dressing up in an outfit that brings to mind some religious palmers, I guess. The author narrates, "If I had known more about the garment when I put on mine in the rag shop, I would have bought a soft wide-brimmed hat to go with it, but I did not, and the shopkeeper's sister told me I looked a good palmer. No doubt she said it with that twinkle of mockery with which she said everything else, but I was concerned with my appearance and failed to notice it. I told her and her brother that I wished I knew more of religion. Both smiled, and the brother said, 'If you mention it first, no one will want to talk about it. Besides, you can get the reputation of being a good fellow by wearing that and not talking about it. When you meet someone you don't want to talk to at all, beg alms.'" So he's saying, if you want a good reputation, then look religious but don't talk about it. If you want people to ignore you, then ask them for money. I'd just like to pause for a quick second and send out a very warm thank you to my Patreon supporters, Joanna and Tommy, as well as to my other supporters, NQD and Cheryl O. It means a lot to me that you would take that very real step in supporting what I do here on YouTube, and it means the world to me. If others are interested in doing the same, the link to my Patreon is included in the description below this video, and I've just started a Patreon exclusive video series, even though I currently only have 2 Patreon supporters, and this series is a very personal look at my life in terms of how I ended up on disability, and it really does cover my whole life because I've never really been very healthy. I've always dealt with chronic illness, so it's just something that I felt was too personal to put out there in the public YouTube sphere. So I made that a Patreon exclusive. If you feel like checking out that series, all you have to do is sign up on Patreon, watch the video, then you can unsign up from Patreon again and go your way. That's fine. If you just want to watch the video, it doesn't matter to me. But I appreciate support in any way it comes, even through just watching this video. There are also a couple of statements of the roles that men and women have fallen to in this society, and very much like the medieval societies on which it's modeled, the women play very much a secondary role. The author mentions early in the book that there used to be women torturers, but that eventually they were banned from being torturers because they would carry it too far. They would become too cruel and take the torture beyond what was asked of them to do. So they imply some kind of inherent cruelty in women. And then later on, a woman character is talking about the role of women in society. She's talking about men like our main character who are out adventuring and doing their thing. And she says, "If we could have our way, no man would have to go roving or draw blood. But women do not make the world. All of you are torturers, one way or another." So I guess the millennia that have passed since modern times haven't been good for women in general. Not that history has been good for women in general. But despite these somewhat interesting points the author makes here and there, overall, it's just a weird book. Weird things happen that seem to make very little sense. And I'm sure if I was a smarter person, I would be able to dig into the story and find all these deep symbolic meanings and allegories and who knows what else that I could learn from these strange events that are happening. But be it as it may, that's all gone over my head, and it just makes for some kind of strange reading. It's hard to explain just how head-scratchingly odd it all is without going deep into the story, but I'll give one just really brief example here. This is another female character that is talking to the main character, and she says, "You don't remember me, do you?" "I didn't think so." She popped a grape into her mouth, and as far as I could see, swallowed it whole. Why is she swallowing grapes whole? I think it mentions it again a few paragraphs later. She swallowed... Yeah, it says, "Jolenta shrugged and swallowed another grape." It has nothing to do with anything, the fact that she's swallowing grapes. I mean, that's just a tiny side thing, and it doesn't compare to some of the weird side events that happen to them that kind of make very little sense. Other than maybe they're just trying to give a picture of the world that has come about since the fall of what would be our futuristic world, but to them, of course, is the distant past, whatever. Speaking of the role of women in this book, another weird thing is that the main character seems to fall head over heels in love with every single female that he happens to come across, and seemingly vice versa too, which is a little strange. And the other thing is, the main character seems to have no problem at all with hitting women. At one point, he strikes his girlfriend so hard that she falls over, and at that point, it goes from weird to absolutely disgusting. And my heart just goes right out of the story. And so I don't feel the need to finish this series, especially when I just spent a gift certificate to a bookstore and picked up the Books of Earthsea, the complete illustrated edition by Ursula K. Le Guin. So I got 992 pages sprinkled with illustrations of the complete Books of Earthsea, none of which I've read so far. So when I have books like this on my shelf, I don't feel quite as compelled to finish reading a series that I'm just not feeling so much. At the end of the day, on the one hand, I was surprised at how quickly I read the book and how easily digestible it was as a reading experience. I was expecting to get into it like a Dickens book, where the beginning of it feels a bit like a slog because of the density of the prose, and then as you get into it, it really starts to blossom and feel more natural. But with this one, it wasn't really like that so much. I actually whipped through it very quickly. So there was enough there to at least keep me interested and keep me doing a lot of reading pretty quickly. So in that sense, the fancy prose wasn't necessarily a barrier to reading the book. What turned me off was just the highly unconventional world that was being inhabited here, and including some just outlandish coincidences. Like at one point the author stumbles upon these certain characters, they go their separate ways, they are in a city that is described as being so vast that the population can't be counted, like millions and millions and millions of people, and yet a day or so later the author happens to run into the same group of people again just out of the blue, and it's one of those weird events that kind of, I guess, turned me off of reading the rest of the series. I did have to laugh, though, at the last sentence in the book. The last paragraph, I should say. The narrator says, "Here I pause. If you wish to walk no further with me, reader, I cannot blame you. It is no easy road." No, I don't wish to walk with you any further. One book was enough. Sadly, my investment in this series is not going to pay off this time. Has anybody else read this book? I think they're fairly old. This series, I should say. It looks like it was originally copyrighted in 1980, so definitely a while back. But I thought it was too bad. It felt like a lot of good writing potential was kind of thrown out the window with how the story came together. But maybe I'm missing all the great stuff that happens in the second, third, and fourth books. Definitely let me know if you've read them. And as always, forever, I am looking for good fantasy writing, so please include your recommendations. Hey, it's Josh. Thank you so much for watching. If you wouldn't mind just crushing that like button, smashing that subscribe button, and chucking the link for this video with someone who you think would enjoy it, by golly, I would appreciate that. Cheers. And we're back to from the previous... Where are there it's hard to explain just how